Precisa ferir a pressão, medir a glicemia ou tomar uma vacina? Na Drogasil tem exames, testes e calendário vacinal completo. E o que é melhor, tem sempre uma Drogasil aí perto de você. É fácil, prático e rápido. Dá para ir entre uma música e outra. Procure nossos farmacêuticos. Quanto mais você conhece o que a gente faz na Drogasil, mais você se cuida.
We may live over 5,000 miles from Lincoln Financial Field, but what we lack in proximity, we make up for in the film study. And each and every week, we'll be bringing you in-depth film breakdowns from across the pond and the Sooner State. Welcome to On the Shane page. I'm your host, Shane Haff, and you can follow me on Twitter at ShaneHaffNFL. I am joined by BGN's own film guru, Jonny Page. Give him a follow on Twitter at JohnnyPage9. Jonny, how are you doing this evening?
I am doing well. We have had a bit of a crazy week. In fact, we've had a bit of a crazy month, haven't we? I'm trying to think back, 26 or 29 episodes? We started the podcast. We've been with VGM Radio. Then we've been independent. Now we're with another network. So I feel like every time we do a podcast, we're talking about new stuff. I think I promised to everyone soon it will get a lot more normal. But yeah, I'm good. It's sort of been exciting, but I know from your point of view, a lot more stressful as well, trying to figure out how we're going to do everything. But I think we're nearly there. I feel like the time is coming where it'll all be sorted out and we can just talk football, which is basically what we want to do 99% of the time after all. But yeah, I am well, but I'm also not renovating my whole house and trying to host a network at the same time, which for all you out there listening, that's basically what Shane is doing now. So I'm not sure how he's got the hours in the day to find it. But yeah, I'm good. How about you, except for doing 101 things at once?
Yeah, it's a little bit stressful. A little behind the scenes, peek behind the curtain, I installed the new flooring in my office today. So I had to disassemble my computer, take it out, put the flooring in, hook it back up, and then my keyboard wouldn't work. For some reason, my Bluetooth keyboard will not connect to my computer. It will connect to other computers. Other Bluetooth devices will connect to my computer. So I'm doing this podcast without a keyboard. So I literally have like the little on-screen keyboard I have to click if I need to pull something up. So that's great. But yeah, a lot of stuff going on. And Jonny mentioned the new network. Those of you that are subscribed to the podcast feed, you might have noticed the name change. It is no longer listed as On the Shane page. It's listed as Eagles Pin Pull, Philadelphia Eagles Network, something like that. I don't even remember the name of it now. Eagles Pin Pull, a Philadelphia Eagles podcast network. So Jonny and I are going to be taking our show to Fans First Sports Network. What does that mean for you guys? Nothing's going to change on your end. If you're subscribed to the show, you're going to get the show because we changed the feed over. The name has changed. The logo is forthcoming. If you are watching it live, you're going to be able to continue to watch it live wherever you're at. The only difference will be if you are listening on an audio platform. Starting in the next couple of weeks, there will be ads inserted into the feed. So if you don't want ads, if you want an ad-free podcast feed, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/ontheshane page, and we will have an ad-free podcast feed through there, along with some other perks we've talked about before, helping us decide players you want to spotlight, some additional podcasts, some things like that. So you can check that out. You can hit us up on Twitter if you've got questions about that. But the podcast is going to stay free. There's going to be some other shows we're working on pulling in. We'll have a post-game show. We'll have some midweek shows, maybe a draft show. Some things like that are still in the works. But it'll be a whole podcast network, and our show will be sort of the flagship episode or weekly show on the network. So be sure you check that out. Hopefully I've explained that well enough. But that's basically what's going on right now. So we're not going anywhere. But we are going to have some ads in the feed moving forward. Did I miss anything on that, Jonny?
No, I was going to say it's been a massive amount of change. But I mean, like for those of you that are listening, some of you know there are people who's like jobs involved with this. And when BGM Radio went down, that was a big deal. And I think we panicked a little bit and didn't ever want to be a part of a network again where we didn't have control of what we did. So it's sort of a perfect partnership. We can run our own thing. We can run our own Patreon. We can run ad free over there. We can still have discussion with you guys live. So we wanted to try and keep the live portion of the podcast as well, because a lot of companies don't like things going live because obviously there's no ad reads when you listen in live. And basically, we've sort of come up with the best case scenario. I think we got a little bit lucky. Yes, there will be a few ads in the recorded podcast, as we mentioned, but if you subscribe on Patreon, and we're going to do more stuff, and we'll talk about that in the future. But we really wanted to keep control of our own feed. We really wanted to control this thing ourselves. We didn't want to be in the hands of other people where all of a sudden it could just be taken away. And that's really sad. And I know how many people tweet at the moment to the old BGM radio guys, and it is depressing every time you see it, how many people are missing those shows. So we didn't want that to happen to you guys in the future. So we're still very new, like podcast game wise, we are very new. And it's all happened a little. We were not planning on this in the slightest. If BGM Radio was still here, we'd still be with them. We'd be completely fine. So we had to sort of figure out what we're going to do on the fly. Yeah, I think you've covered everything, Shane. I think we've tried to do the best of both worlds, considering what we need, but also what you guys need. And I think we got lucky. I think it's like a pretty perfect partnership. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So the plus for you guys is that you're going to start getting some other shows in this feed. Not a lot right away, but as we move towards the season, we're going to figure that out and get some other talented guys in this feed, maybe to introduce you guys to for the first time. So Austin says on YouTube that he's stoked for the new network. He also suggests we could just start a flooring podcast. So maybe that might be better video content, but I could sure help people install floors. But all that aside, we're going to get into what we promised last week. We're going to do a look around the NFC East. Last week, we overviewed and reacted to the Eagles draft class. This week, we're going to do the same for the other three teams in the NFC East, a little more abbreviated than what we did with the Eagles, obviously, but we'll talk through the picks, what we liked, what we didn't like, and sort of how we saw the draft shaking out for other teams. So we'll start with the Dallas Cowboys, the team that is the biggest competitor to the Philadelphia Eagles for the division crown. And so I've got a graphic here that Jonny found and sent to me, since I can't even Google things now, with the Cowboys draft class. And so in the first round with pick 29, they selected Tyler Guyton, offensive tackle out of Oklahoma. In the second round at pick 56, they took Marshawn Kneeland, defensive end out of Michigan. In the third round, they took Cooper Beebe, interior offensive lineman, at pick 73 out of Kansas State. They also took Maurice Liufau, a linebacker from Notre Dame in the third round. And then on day 3, they took Kalen Carson, Ryan Flournoy, Nathan Thomas, and Justin Rogers. Jonny, when you look at the Cowboys draft, what sort of stuck out to you about the players they selected and their approach overall?
Yeah, so when I think of the recent Cowboys, I can't get Ezekiel out of my head. That man annoyed me a lot as an Eagles fan. I think of like top offensive line, run the football, sort of a couple of explosive playmakers out wide. So I totally get what they did offensive line wise. I actually think they had a very good draft offensive line wise. Like Tyler Guyton was to be fair, I had him basically ranked as a first, second round player. So he went right where I think he would. He fits the Cowboys style. He's extremely athletic, extremely powerful, big arms, fluid mover. I think he's one of those players who's a little bit raw. And I think he's an interesting player actually, because I see him as a tackle. He's quite raw. I don't know if he's too long. I haven't read where they're planning on playing him, but I had him down as a tackle mainly. I did like him though. To be fair, I liked all of their early picks. I'm not going to lie here and say, because I'm an Eagles fan, I didn't like them. So we might talk about a little bit more specifics. I really like Kneeland. He's one of the most interesting edge rushers in the class. He was a little bit all over the map. Some people seem to really like him, and some people seem to really not like him. He's big for an edge. He's 267 pounds, so he's much more of a 4-3 defensive end. So for certain teams, he wouldn't be on their board. Like, for example, I doubt the Eagles would have had a huge grade on him. He is a little stiff. He's a little frantic, but he's big and he's strong. He's a big run defender. He's very, very aggressive. If all else fails, I wrote he will just basically run through offensive linemen. And I think the Eagles are lucky that they're pretty stout at offensive tackle. But my favorite pick was someone that we spoke about before, someone that I wanted the Eagles to go after, actually. Cooper Beebe. I had him as like a round 2 grade and a very solid round 2 grade. I think he's a really strong interior prospect. He's the kind of guy who just ticks all the intangible boxes. Good athlete, efficient at the second level, 45 career starts in a row. played both guard and tackle. Like, I see him as a starting guard. I'm not sure. I think they might play him. Well, I mean, they will play him as an interior. I really like the start. However, before I throw it back over to you, the thing that I found really odd was that two things I mentioned there about playmakers and running the ball. It's all very well putting up off the offensive line, and I'm not a big running backs matter massively guy, but I think you need something. And I was really surprised they didn't take an athletic running back somewhere with an explosive element to his game. I'm really surprised, basically, they didn't add an earlier offensive playmaker, maybe one or two wide receivers. It's quite a boring class when you go tackle, defensive end, guard, linebacker, and that's fine. But I feel like in NFL these days, it's not just about fantasy. Like, those plays and do matter. Like, explosive plays matter massively. So I'm not going to talk too much about the round 6 onwards because I'm not sure about those guys. I watched a lot of corners. I watched a lot of receivers. I never watched the 2, but they took, which is a good sign because I watched quite a lot. But overall, I sort of like their players, and I don't dislike where they took their players either. But I'm not the biggest fan of their strategy. What about you? I think we see the players relatively similar, but I don't think I've heard your take on Neeland or Guyton. So are you sort of similar to me or a little bit different?
Yeah, so Tyler Guyton, we talked about Guyton. He was the one guy I did not want the Eagles to take in the first round. And it wasn't because I don't think he's a good player. I think he's really raw. There's a lot of rawness to his game, and I did not like the idea of changing his position from right tackle to right guard. And so for the Cowboys, he's going to be changing sides. He's going to be going right tackle to left tackle. And more than likely, they have Terrence Steele at right tackle. He's likely their left tackle this year. And so that's a change for him. And I don't really like that for Tyler Guyton. He's really raw because he didn't play offensive tackle until he got to college. He was a 3-star as a defensive end coming out of high school. So I thought, I think he's got a tremendous amount of upside. I think it might take him a little while to get there, especially switching sides of the ball. And so that's a little concerning if you're the Cowboys, a team that is essentially in a win now window, right? They have the strangeness of the Dak contract situation. He's on the last year of his deal. They have not extended him, and he has a no trade / no tag clause in his contract. So if Dak doesn't like the offer, he can be guaranteed to hit free agency after this year. So you're in a bit of a win now window, and you took a guy that I think is maybe a project to change sides of the ball in the first round. Now, I do like Guyton, and I do think that's partially who the Cowboys wanted all along. And so they did read the board well, moving down to get a 3rd-round pick to go ahead and take the guy they already wanted. But you look at what impact does it make this year? And I'm not so sure they're not going to end up having to kick Tyler Smith out to left guard. Now, when you look at the rest of their draft, Neeland, I wasn't as high on Neeland. He was the number 85 player on my board. I thought he's a one-dimensional guy. He's a good run stopper. He's got a good bull rush, but that's kind of it. And then you have Cooper Beebe, who I loved. Cooper Beebe was the number 37 guy on my board. He tested a lot more athletically than he looks on film, and he's extremely short arms, not much length, but I really like Cooper Beebe. He's a guy, like you said, that we talked about maybe the Eagles going to get. And so I think he's going to plug in and help out the right side of their line. I'm just not sure what you're going to get out of Guyton and Neeland early on. And so to me, this was a meat and potatoes draft for the future when you're in a must-win window right now. And Austin mentioned a minute ago, he was surprised the Cowboys didn't go wide receiver. And that's where I'm at. Who is your wide receiver too? Like, they needed to get CeeDee Lamb some help. I would have, especially in this sort of a wide receiver class, I think I would have pushed those chips in on let's go get a receiver, not necessarily in the first round, but in the second round, and try to go win this thing this year.
Sorry, I decided to leave myself on mute there. Yeah, I'm the same. I think you described it really well, actually, as a meat and potatoes draft and a win now team. When you're playing Dak, when you're playing CD, you need a little bit more. And it's a little bit it's a boring class. That's the way I describe it. If I was a fan, there's not really too many things to get excited about. You mentioned Austin's comment there just a second ago about, is he an off-ball linebacker? I watched a little bit of, you can pronounce him better than me. Is it Leafu?
Leafau.
Leah
I
Fan, there
think
you go.
I've heard it pronounced several different ways.
I just assume that because you're American, you pronounce it more correctly. So I'm just going to keep assuming that. He's like a big off-ball linebacker, but he's not particularly strong against the run, despite the fact he's big. I didn't have anywhere near. I mean, I watched him briefly, and I basically only tried to watch top 100 guys, and I made up my mind pretty quickly that he wasn't going to be there for me. So I didn't really watch him in too much depth. So I can't really speak to him too much, but he looked a little bit. He looked like an edge rusher at an off-ball linebacker's body. Like he's quite long. I think he's got quite a good arm length, and I think he's quite a good blitzer from off-ball linebacker. But I'm not really sure that's what a lot of teams do as much these days. So he was a slightly odd one for me. He was slightly too early. I think just looking very quickly at the Cowboys depth chart, the thing that stands out to me is that we were talking about this off air before. When you see like the offensive line looks pretty strong to me. I think there's a relatively good chance they're going to be strong up front, but a Deuce Vaughn, Rico Dowdle, Ezekiel Elliott, like they don't scare you at all. There's no explosiveness there. I'm going to use your phrase again. That's a very meat and potatoes type running back room. It's very much you need 4, you get 5, but you're not going to create any big plays there. I'm really surprised, like a Tyrone Tracy or somebody they didn't go after in round 4 or 5, just someone with some explosiveness. And then you look at their receiver room, Shane. I mean, it's CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and who? You're looking at CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and Jalen Tolbert as your top 3, and Tolbert did not have a great rookie season and is extremely unpolished. Then you've got next guys coming up. Like it's not great when you've got like Turpin, Jalen Brooks. Like there's very little there. There's really, really little there. And even behind Jake Ferguson, Luke Schoonmaker, I liked him as like a blocking tight end, but again, not particularly explosive. Like you just feel like they're missing something. If I was a Cowboys fan, I feel like the draft suffered because they didn't sign well enough in free agency. I think you can get starting guards and you can get sort of off-ball linebackers without using the 3rd round. You can find those guys in the draft. In free agency. I would have gone down that route in free agency, and then they could have added some explosive talent in rounds 2 and 3. I also think they absolutely tipped their hand with the Jonathan Brooks thing, and it seemed like clear that they wanted Jonathan Brooks, and then Jerry Jones decided to tell the world they want Jonathan Brooks. But I can't believe that offense is how they're going to go into the season, and I wouldn't be surprised if they make a splash, whether it's overpaying somebody. I wondered if they go for Odell Beckham, but I know he's already signed now. But I'm not too fearful of that team. If I'm going to spend a lot of time on the offensive line, I really want a good running back behind it. Otherwise, it feels a little bit like, what's the point? They're going to be relying massively on CeeDee Lamb this year. Like their offense is going to run through CeeDee. If CeeDee gets hurt, I'm not particularly fearful. If you look at them team as a competitor to the Eagles, which I think they are, like I think the Eagles roster is better. And I'm an Eagles fan, so of course I'm going to say that. But you look at what the Eagles managed to do. They managed to add some like elite playmaking talent with Saquon Barkley, and then managed to keep their 2 elite wide receivers. I don't really see it with the Cowboys, and I might be wrong. And they always win games. They won a lot of games the past 3 years, not in the playoffs, but they do win a lot of games. They do win a lot of games in the regular season. But it feels to me like they're short this year. And it'd be interesting to see how they take it. I don't really have much else on their late round guys, unless you've got anything else to add, because they were not people that I watched.
Yeah, the thing with Jonathan Brooks is hilarious that you get Jerry Jones at the podium after night 1, just talking about how Jonathan Brooks is very high on their board, and then the Panthers trade up ahead of them to take him. And to be clear, it was a bad move by the Panthers, and the Panthers probably saved the Cowboys from themselves there. But that one was definitely a funny one to see that play out. So overall for me, the Cowboys had 4 top 100 picks, and they took 3 top 100 players, according to my big board. If you look at consensus draft grades, I put this up last week. Eagles up near the top at number 3. The Cowboys are down at the bottom at number 26 on the aggregate draft grades. So obviously take draft grades for what they're worth, but draft grades are an evaluation of the process, and a good process generally wins out over time. I wasn't a huge fan of what the Cowboys did, and not just because they're a rival. There's other teams. Well, actually, that's honestly not true. There's not really another team that I just really love what they did, but we'll get into those here in a minute. So a couple comments here. Nova on YouTube says, glad you guys are back. Excited to see the growth at the new spot. Austin says, it almost feels like Jerry is just setting McCarthy and Dak up to fail so he can move on. And Anthony says they will definitely not have wins in the playoffs. So we'll keep that continuing. Austin also mentions the time that Jerry Jones held his board up to the camera one year. And I do remember, I think it was his son was like pulling his arm back down, but that's always funny. Jerry Jones is always good for a laugh there.
Yeah, Cowboys are a strange team, man. They're a strange team. I don't really get their off season. And I'm an Eagles fan, so I'm biased. But there are some teams which we're going to talk about in a second, actually, that I do like. But I didn't really get what they did. Should we move on to a team as we're being very negative that I'm going to give some praise to? Strangely, do you want to talk about Washington next? If you've got that up on your screen,
yes, let's do it. So the Washington Commanders. I'll put it up here on the screen. In the first round, pick number 2, they took quarterback Jaden Daniels out of LSU. In the second round, they took defensive tackle Jerzan Newton and cornerback Mike Sanderstill and tight end Ben Sinnott. In the third round, they took Brandon Coleman and Luke McCaffrey. And then on day 3, they took Jordan Maggie, Dominique Hampton, and Javonte Jean-Baptiste. So, Johnny, you said you're going to talk positively about the Commanders. Talk to me about the Commanders draft. What was your initial impression?
Yeah, it's been a while since I would talk positively about a Commanders draft. Like the Commanders have done everything wrong of late. It's a weird one basically because I'm going to give you lots of positives, but I'm also going to say I disagree with their biggest pick. So the thing that really matters, I don't necessarily agree with. So let's skip the negatives for a second. I love like pick 2, 3, 4, 5. Like I mean, Johnny Newton, Josiah Newton, whatever you want to call him, he was my guy. Like you heard me talking about him off air, on air, in fact, on our pre-draft podcast. I think his injury massively hit him. And I don't know how bad the injury is. So that's a good news for the Eagles is that he maybe won't be expected to be as good as he was. But for me, he was my defense tackle 1. Like I'd have considered trading up for him. I think he's awesome. Like I really think he's good. He was up there with Leatu as my favorite defensive players to watch. Like I don't rank players, and I wish I did this year because I love it when you say things like he was my 54th player, and I'm just like I've just got him in this tier. But he would have been up there as my top 20 player, maybe my second or third best defensive player in this class. Shane, like I really, really liked him. So I'm a little bit annoyed that the Washington have got him, but I'm also quite happy. I still can't call them the Commanders, by the way. It's a fake name. I still say Washington. But I'm still quite, in some ways, I'm weirdly happy because I get to watch him. I'll see how he goes up against the Eagles. Then Mike Sanderstill, I like. Basically, I think they picked him where I would have taken him around the second round. I didn't think he was maybe any better than that, but I think he's a good cornerback prospect. I imagine he'll start in the slot for them because he's slightly undersized, but I think he's like one of those explosive athletes, can play nickel or safety. Not the best long speed, which is why he's probably nickel, but I just think he's a tough, competitive slot corner who will hold his own in coverage and in run defense. Then we've got my guy. They took 2 of my guys, which is sad. Like, I can't believe they took my guy in the second round in Ben Sinnott. Like, he was not a second round pick for me. But he was my tight end 3. And to be honest, he was arguably my tight end 2. I sort of went back and forth with him and Jatavian Sanders. But I liked Sinnott more. Like, I just found him fun to watch. He's like a fullback hybrid, tight end sort of H-back. Elite testing, like tested off the charts, 9.92. RAS score, change of direction, short area quickness. He's a player that I would say will help your team more than your fantasy rosters. So he'll get overdrafted in fantasy and then people will go mad about wasting a pick on Ben Sinnott. But I think he's just a good football player. He's just a good football player who does the right thing consistently. And then I didn't even mind Brandon Coleman. I think if you're going to take like a project at tackle, then at least make sure you take like elite athletes in the third round, like experience at guard and tackle, tested absolutely off the charts, like 9.97 RAS score. Has played left tackle, played guard, arm length, size, physical in run game. The problem he's got is didn't play as well last year, I think due to injury. But I think if he gets back to full potential, he's just got like perfect tackle size, like 313, 6'4". So I really liked Coleman as well. I didn't mind Luke McCaffrey as well. I didn't watch him too much, but I think at pick 100, that's pretty decent value as well. And I think Jordan McGee is someone that I didn't get around to watching, but I know I saw people online that I trust who like him as well. So I liked sort of everything but from rounds 2 to 5. Before we chat about the quarterback, any thoughts on anyone I've mentioned? Anyone you strongly disagree? What do you think?
Yeah, they took a great player in Johnny Newton falling into the second round. One thing that does stink for them is that it was a defensive tackle that fell instead of an offensive tackle. Like, you would have thought, as many offensive linemen were in this draft and as light as defense was early on, there was a good chance that you could get an offensive tackle, which would have been a lot bigger impact. I mean, they're really set at defensive tackle, but he was such a good value. He was 19 overall on my big board, my top ranked interior defensive lineman, and they got him at 36. And even though that's a position of strength for them, I think when a guy that you evaluate that highly starts to fall, you go get him and you can figure the rest of it out later. And so I liked that approach. I thought that was a smart move. Sandra, he was number 48 on my board. They took him at 50. It's appropriate value. I think he's going to be a high level slot cornerback. He's got that wide receiver background. He's got really good ball skills. So I liked that pick for them. Ben Sinnott. I didn't think anyone was higher on Ben Sinnott than me. And Washington took him 20 spots ahead of where I had him. I had him at 72. They took him at 53. To me, that one was a reach. I like the player. I just think that's a reach. I also highly doubt that a Dan Quinn-led team with Cliff Kingsbury as your offensive coordinator is going to be creative enough to use Ben Sinnott in his best usage. So I thought that was a reach, and I didn't particularly like the fit either there. And Brandon Coleman's a guy, he wasn't in my top 100, so I thought that one was a bit of a reach as well. The one that really killed me, aside from Jaden Daniels, and we'll get to, and it seems silly to quibble about pick 100, but you really took Luke McCaffrey at pick 100 when Troy Franklin was still on the board. And I just don't get that. Any team that took a wide receiver in the third round and it wasn't Troy Franklin, I'm going to ding you for that, because Troy Franklin was a top 55 player on my board. Luke McCaffrey was not in my top 100, but I looked at the consensus big board and he was at 155. So I didn't particularly like that one either. But then we get to Jaden Daniels versus Drake May, and I just think that's a really big mistake. And we'll see how it plays out. He's going to come in, and his mobility gives you a certain floor. That's something I always talk about with rookie quarterbacks. Your ability to improvise and to scramble raises your floor. And Jaden Daniels is a really good running threat. And I've seen comparisons to Lamar Jackson and his rushing ability. The thing about Lamar Jackson is he's not so small and he doesn't take hits. You can go watch Jaden Daniels just get lit up at times in college football. And I just don't think his frame can survive that at the NFL level. And so he's going to have to learn to mitigate risk, to get down, to avoid those big hits. And then there's the playing quarterback portion of it as well. And you look at, he threw to Malik Neighbors and he threw to Brian Thomas Jr. this year at LSU. And, one of my favorite things about Jaden Daniels is mentioning that Jaden Daniels has been in college for so long that he threw a touchdown pass to Brandon Ayuk when Brandon Ayuk was in college at Arizona State. So this is an older prospect, a late bloomer who really took off when he had 2 first-round picks at wide receiver. That gives you a little bit of concern. If Jaden Daniels hits and if he stays healthy, that athleticism is going to make him a super exciting player. But we see Anthony Richardson last year, who's a bigger guy, and how he struggled to stay on the field. And now I look at Jaden Daniels, and I just thought Drake May was a lot better prospect. Jaden Daniels was the number 15 guy on my board. He was my QB3. I would have said this draft was a slam dunk for the Commanders if they took Drake May. As an Eagles fan, I was really excited when they took Jaden Daniels, and maybe that will turn out to be something people will old takes expose me on in a few years. But for now, I'm still happy that Daniels was the pick instead of May.
Yeah, I'm going to give you 2 points, then we'll move on. I think are interesting. Firstly, just before I get onto the Daniels stuff, I just think Washington in general, when you look at their team, it looks quite well-rounded now. Like, looking at the depth chart, I think they did a good job in the offseason of sort of managing to rebuild. Like, when you look at their roster in general, I feel like you've got you've got some decent talent, which they haven't had in a while. I think offensively, they're not going to be brilliant. They're not expecting to get to the playoffs this year. They're building for the future. But, you've got Benson up maybe as your Titan 2. You've got a rookie quarterback. I like Brian Robinson a lot as like your hammer, and Austin Eckler, if he's got anything left, as your third down back. McLaurin, Dotson, McCaffrey. I like the sign, for example, Zacchaeus, I think as wide receiver 4 is a great signing. Like, I think the Eagles didn't use him. You've got De'Ami Brown as your wide receiver 5 to see if there's anything else there. I think where they're really strong is up front now. Like Deron Payne, Jonathan Allen, and Johnny Newton is a really, really good top 3. They've got some young talent at cornerback, Emmanuel Forbes, who I just remember AJ Brown killing, but I think he actually played quite well outside of that. They've just got like a little bit more talent. I feel like they're a team that is doing the right things all of a sudden. And I can't say that about Washington for a long time because they've basically been a bit of a train wreck for years. It looks to me like they're on the right track. Off-season podcast idea that you just give me the idea to get into. I would love to do a series of getting experts on talking about how different positions are now valued. Because talking about the quarterback, I think the quarterback position, this is so interesting. Like, I think 3 years ago, Drake May is absolutely quarterback 2 in this draft behind Caleb Williams. I think 6 years ago, Drake May is QB1. Like, Caleb Williams would not be QB1 6-7 years ago. And I think maybe even as early as last year. I mean, I think the fact there's an NFL team willing to take Jaden Daniels over Drake May is fascinating because it just tells you where the NFL is going in terms of quarterback. They are so much more obsessed on playmaking, on outside the pocket, that they're willing to base. I mean, like Drake May has got it all, like size, 6'4", like 220 plus, like huge arm, all the throws. Like, it's pretty incredible for someone like me growing up who has learned the quarterback position from people like Greg Cosell and looking at that style of pocket quarterback. I've had to adjust the way that I view the position as well, Shane, because I would have never considered, and like you, I think most guys who've watched football for a long time would have Drake May above Jaden Daniels. Like, I think Jaden Daniels was very light as well. I know there's like a quarterback threshold of about 215 pounds, and Nate Tice goes on about a lot. And he falls below the threshold. Like, I don't think NFL teams would have considered him anywhere near a top 3 pick 3-4 years ago. And yeah, I'm throwing it out there now as an off-season idea that we should remember and make a note rather than me just saying it here. But I would love to speak to sort of someone in the QB game about why that change has happened, because I think it's fascinating. I understand playmaking, but I'm shocked that an NFL team took Jaden Daniels over Drake May, like really shocked. It feels like something draft Twitter would have done 2 years ago, not necessarily what an NFL franchise would do. But you know what? If it works, then they're going to be dangerous because he's an incredibly explosive athlete. He's a freakish runner. As you mentioned, he's probably not Lamar Jackson, but he's not miles off. And they've got some playmaking talent around him. They've got a decent running game. They can rush the quarterback now on defense. They've got a strong interior, and they've got some playmakers at receiver. So they're going to be. They seem like a middle of the road 8-8 team, or 9-8, 8-9, whatever you want to call it these days. But I feel like they had a pretty good draft. They managed to slowly rebuild the team, and I think in a year or two, if Jaden Daniels hits, they're probably going to be more of a threat than maybe even someone like the Cowboys, who, in my opinion, are on sort of the other trajectory. Any final thoughts before we throw it to our final team?
Yeah, so Jaden Daniels is 73rd percentile height and only 15th percentile weight.
That's tiny.
So very tiny frame. Also, you mentioned Emmanuel Forbes. He was really bad last year. Actually, it wasn't just an AJ
Was he really
Brown
bad?
thing.
Fair enough. Maybe I've got my pre-draft bias. I can't pretend to watch the Redskins shouldn't say that, to watch Washington every week.
He was benched at one point in the season, and then later on in the year, I think it was an elbow injury or an arm injury, and it kind of became is he still hurt or is he benched sort of thing? And he played a little bit the last couple weeks, but Forbes had a rough year last year for sure.
I guess I would just say is that cornerback is really hard to start as a rookie, especially for a bad defense. So I wouldn't totally kill Emmanuel Forbes yet. But yeah, fair enough. I think. Yeah,
the experts seem to like the Commanders draft. They were ranked 4th in the aggregate rankings. I wouldn't have them that high. I would probably have them that high if they'd taken Drake May. But the Jaden Daniels, I just think it was the wrong quarterback there. So we'll go to a couple comments and we'll move on to our last team. Eagles Eric says Luke McCaffrey over Javon Baker was a wild pick. Rufus says that aside from Daniels, I strongly loved Washington's draft. I felt like they made a typical mistake taking the wrong QB at 3. He meant to, though. Anthony was sad that they got Jordan Maggie. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that last name, but and then Eagles Eric says that Forbes gave up more yards per coverage snap than any starting corner in the NFL other than Marco Wilson last year.
Maybe we'll ignore my he played quite well comment. You can tell, guys, I watch a lot of Eagles football. I only watch them against us. I was giving him some credit because AJ Brown killed him. And I
AJ Brown does kill a lot of people.
I know, it's not fair, is it? It's not fair. Right, let's talk about a team that I don't think had a particularly good draft. Talk to me about the Giants. What did they do?
Okay, so the Giants in the first round at pick 6 selected Malik Neighbors, wide receiver out of LSU. In the second round at pick 47, they selected safety Tyler Nubin out of Minnesota. In the third round at pick 70, they selected cornerback Andrew Phillips out of Kentucky. And then on day 3, they took Theo Johnson, Tyrone Tracy, and Darius Masau. I'm unclear if I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. When I look at their draft, Malik Neighbors at 6, he was my wide receiver 3. I liked Rome Odunze better. To me, if you don't have a quarterback, you should be taking a quarterback unless you just don't like them. And I don't think JJ McCarthy should have gone that high, so I'm not going to kill them for not taking JJ McCarthy. I will say, if they liked McCarthy, that's got to be the pick there. You cannot take a wide receiver when Daniel Jones is your quarterback and he's heading into basically the last year before you can get rid of him. So it's rough for Giants fans to walk out without a quarterback. It would also be rough for a quarterback to get inserted into the system where there are no wide receivers. So I liked Malik Neighbors. I just liked Rome Odunze a little bit better. Tyler Nubin is a guy that I really liked. He was my number 30 player. They got him at 47. I know he didn't run well, but he was such a good player in college. He's the all-time career leader in interceptions at Minnesota. I think he's got terrific instincts at the position. So I liked that pick. I did not like the Andrew Phillips pick. Taking him at 70, he was number 93 on the consensus big board. He wasn't in my top 100. He just wasn't a cornerback that I liked a whole lot. So for that to be their haul out of the first 3 rounds, I like 2 of the players. And I would have taken a different receiver, but I certainly understand the compulsion to go address wide receiver. For me, it's a little sad if I'm a Giants fan that we weren't able to address offensive line, which is clearly a need as well, given the amount of offensive line talent on the board.
Yeah, I have a weird actually love-hate relationship with the Giants draft. So I actually like a lot of the players they took. I just don't really get what the Giants are doing as an organization. So, it's just not enough picks. If you're going to rebuild, you need to take shots on players. There's just, how can you end up with that few picks when you've got that bad of a roster? And then next year, it's not like they've got multiple future firsts. They got another second in the Leonard Williams trade to the Seahawks. So they've got an extra pick next year, but it's not like they've got 10 picks. I mean, the Eagles have got, I believe, more picks than them next year already. And the roster's just a bit of a mess. I guess they're going down I assume they're going to be tanking route this year and trying to get an early pick next year, which is fine. But individually, I like the players. I don't like Phillips, quarterback. I watched him briefly. And then based on my rule that I was only watching people that I wanted to watch based on where I think they could go, I watched him for a little bit. I did actually rank him. I had him as a 4th. Slightly undersized. He's a bit physical, but I think he was a little bit stiff. I said he's got limitations as maybe a future slot defender, but he's got no interceptions throughout his whole career and doesn't play the ball well at the catch point. And cornerbacks to have 0 interceptions always screams a little bit red flag. Theo Johnson was an interesting one because people loved him. I was nowhere near as high on him as other people were. So I had him around the 4th round. So he went roughly where I thought he would. He's basically a freak athlete who did nothing. Stupidly good athlete. I don't think he ever passed, I can't remember if he got 300 yards or something, but I think he only ever got 75 yards in a game once. So freak athlete who's got nothing to him. But then I really like the other guys. Tyrone Tracy was my guy. But the weird thing is Tyrone Tracy's my guy for a team that have Saquon Barkley. He's not my guy if he's going to actually play a lot. And I look at their offense and think, you've got Devin Singletary, and that's pretty much it. He if Devin Singletary gets injured, he might be the guy. And I don't think that's what you want Tyrone Tracy to do. You want him to be like a scat back, limited manufactured touches. I love Tyler Nubin, like you. He was my safety one. I wasn't as high on him as you, but I'm a big fan of Tyler Nubin. And then what can you say about Malik Neighbors, man? Like, he's awesome. Like, I mean, do I wish he was on the Giants? No. Am I going to enjoy watching him twice a year? Yes. Like, he's just explosive as they get. I had Adunze slightly above of him as well. I think that kind of player, you need him to really be good to take him as high as 6, but I think he will be. I describe their draft as potential. Like, they've got players that if they hit their athletic potential, Tyrone Tracy, Theo Johnson, they're going to be really good. But if they don't, they're going to be stuck with a receiver and a safety and not much else for a team that needs a lot of help. I mean, you look at their depth chart and like Jalen Hyatt, starting receiver with Isaiah Hodgins and Wandale Robinson. There's a lot of talent that hasn't lived up to it. I mean, the tight end room's a bit of a mess. Like, Theo Johnson, to me, is potential, and he might be starting because who knows what happened to Darren Waller. There's loads of reports that Drew Lock's going to be their quarterback one because Daniel Jones doesn't seem really fit. And then their defense is pretty weak as well. Like, I guess they're playing the rebuild game. And if I'm playing the rebuild game, I'd want to swing for the fences a few more times. But it makes you wonder if they really are going for that QB1 next year. And maybe we'll look back at this next year and say, actually tanking it, taking some future projecting players like Theo Johnson and Tyrone Tracy who won't be great this year. Maybe that's the plan. But I think that sometimes credits teams with looking in the future more than they are. And I'm not sure Brian Dable is going, yeah, let's suck this year and I'll have my choice at quarterback next year. I think general managers and head coaches don't always get that luxury to look a year ahead. So maybe it'll all work out perfectly. They'll do a Chicago Bears. They'll happen to get the first pick and everyone will credit them for a great draft because the Panthers happen to suck. Sometimes you get lucky when you draft. I like the players. I just don't think there's enough of them. Like, 6 players is not a lot, and to only have 1 extra pick next year, that just feels a little bit odd.
Not to mention,
I do individually like them. Sorry, I do individually like a lot of their players. I'm going to be honest.
Not to mention that it's hard to be that forward thinking when you're probably entering this season on the hot seat. Like Brian Dable, Joe Shane, they're probably on the hot seat. If they end up with the number 1 overall pick, I'm not sure that Joe Shane is the guy that will be making that pick. I'm not sure Brian Daboll is the guy that'll be coaching that pick. Like, the seats were getting hot at the end of this last season. And, you know, Joe Shane hasn't been there terribly long, but you look at how they handled the Saquon and the Daniel Jones contracts, just horribly mismanaged that situation. And I think Brian Dable has exceeded expectations the first year, and the second year is about what it should have been, but he set that bar too high too early. And I think he was catching heat at the end of the year. And apparently he's a difficult guy to work with as well, which has started to come out. So the Giants are really interesting. Kind of like you said, I like their top 2 picks. If I wasn't going to go quarterback, I almost would have wanted to try to trade out of 6, I feel like, and amass some more capital. I feel like that's what rebuilding teams do. And they didn't do that. So I like the players. I think they'll be fun to watch, but overall, not the most exciting draft. And when you look at the consensus grades, they slotted in just middle of the pack. They were 14th out of 32 teams. So somewhere in like that solid C+-ish range. So everybody else kind of thought the way that we did about them, just higher on the Commanders draft than we were. So go to a couple of comments here. Rufus said that I think 80% of the league would have taken May. There's always the team that just wants to be the smartest in the room. Austin says that, talking about the Giants, they could have taken Bo Nix if they'd been able to unscramble Denver's draft board. Did you see that report?
No, I haven't actually. So there was rumors that the Giants like Bo Nix then?
No. So apparently Sean Payton. So the way I'm going to find it here. So from Albert Breer, in order to keep their QB preferences a secret, the Broncos draft board in the draft room was not in order of preference. Instead, it was just random. Only Sean Payton, George Patton, and Greg Penner knew the order.
Yeah, because you got to keep Bo Nix a secret, because that was someone that everyone was. It does make you wonder, by the way, just going back to your point a second ago, like, I'm shocked the Giants couldn't get someone to bite at 6. Like, really surprised they couldn't move down. Like, I love Neighbors as well, but is Neighbors going to be a 1 or is he more of a 1B? And they could have done with like an Adunze as more of your traditional 1. But for a team that just needs players, like, I'm shocked they couldn't get the Vikings to come up. I'm shocked they couldn't get the Raiders to come up. Like, there must have been teams out there after quarterbacks. And if you're not going to take a quarterback, put it this way, if you're not taking one at 6 and 6 go in the top 12 and only 3 have gone before you pick, like, I feel like they must have been slow on the phones there. Like, Harry's getting something done. Like, somehow, somewhere, he is doing something at that pick. It just felt like, basically, Malik Neighbors feels like an unbelievably great luxury pick. Like, what a fantastic luxury pick that is for a team that are not really in that position yet. But there you go. That's just my personal opinion. And I love Malik Neighbors, so I'm hardly going to downplay them. I'm with you. It feels like they should have been able to get someone to come up. But they couldn't. And sometimes those picks are huge. Like that trade, if you get a future first from a team next year, like the Bears did, that team sucks. Like that changes your franchise. So they don't have that. That's what I mean. When I look at teams that rebuild, I look at next year and I think I want to see like 2 firsts or 2 firsts and 2 set. And they haven't really got a huge amount of ammo. The plan basically feels to be hope we suck this year, draft a quarterback high next year. But those plans don't always work. Sometimes you win a few lucky games. You get like pick 6, you end up trading up mortgaging your future and praying that the guy you pick is right. So yeah, I found their strategy a little bit odd.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is going to do it for our NFC East draft recap. So if you wanted to hear us talk about the Eagles picks, we did that last week. Starting next week, we're going to start going through doing a little bit more film breakdown for the Eagles picks. It'll probably take us a couple of weeks worth of episodes to work through all of those guys. But if you followed our show during the regular season, you sort of know the format for how we do these film shows. And we will be doing that. If you guys are watching live, please do us a favor and go subscribe to the podcast feed as well. That'll help us out over on Fans First Sports Network. So be sure you subscribe there. Ratings and reviews, very much appreciated. But Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you want to get your podcasts, it should be out there for you to find. Before we get out of here, Jonny, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave the people with?
I still find it mental that people comment on the show live about an NFC East draft recap. So thank you if you are watching live. Basically, I think just quickly, we've always said we want to be really in depth. Like this is sort of the point of it. We don't want to just get content out for the sake of getting content out. So we are going to watch them quite in depth. Like I'm going to spend a lot of my time watching Jennings Hunt, and we'll talk about him maybe next week or the week after. But we might be a little bit slower than some people on the draft recaps. But I guess the idea is that we really want you to feel like you really understand the players really well, rather than just on a basic level. So yeah, we'll start next week, and that'll be fun because I've been getting in depth into the first 2 picks. But I'm really, really looking forward to doing Hunt because I know very little about him. So yeah, thank you guys. Please do guys subscribe, 5-star ratings, you know the drill. But more than anything, just keep listening, and it's massively appreciated.
All right. We do very much appreciate you guys, and we will catch you next week for another episode of On the Shane Page.